The whiskey bottle hit the stage and shattered, and when the man in the front row stood up and shouted, "That's just water. The guy's been lying to us for years," the orchestra stopped mid-note, and 500 people in the Stardust Showroom turned to stare at Dean Martin with his microphone in one hand and broken glass at his feet. Wait, because what Dean did in the next 60 seconds became one of the most talked-about moments in Vegas history, and almost nobody understood what it actually cost him. The stage lights were bright enough that Dean couldn't see past the third row, but he could hear the man perfectly. 50s, maybe. Thick Long Island accent. Expensive suit that didn't fit quite right. The kind of guy who'd saved up for months to bring his wife to Vegas and see the King of Cool in person. The kind of guy who now felt like he'd been cheated. Dean's hand was still frozen in the position it had been when he'd gestured with the bottle. The gesture that had sent J and B, or what everyone thought was J and B, flying out of his grip and onto the polished wood. Clear liquid was spreading in a pool around the shattered glass, catching the stage lights, and Dean could see people in the front rows leaning forward, squinting at it. Someone in the back called out, "Let him talk." Another voice, closer. "Is that true, Dean?" The orchestra leader, Manny Rodriguez, had his baton half raised, looking between Dean and the puddle like he was trying to solve a math problem. The piano player had both hands on the keys, but wasn't pressing them. Dean could hear his own breathing through the microphone, which he'd forgotten he was still holding close. Notice something about that moment. 500 people, all of them paying customers, all of them watching a carefully constructed performance that Dean and his writers had spent years perfecting. The drunk act, the lovable lush, the man who made scotch and cigarettes look like the definition of cool. And now some guy from Long Island was standing in a showroom pointing at a puddle and calling it water. Dean lowered the microphone slowly. The man in the front row was still standing, his wife tugging at his jacket sleeve, whispering something urgent that Dean couldn't hear. But the man wasn't sitting down. His face was red, and he was looking around at the other tables like he was trying to get them on his side. "You hear me?" the man said. "Louder now. It's water. I can see it from here. You think we're all stupid?" Dean set the microphone on its stand, walked to the edge of the stage, looked down at the man, close enough now that he could see the sweat on the guy's forehead, the way his hands were shaking just slightly, close enough to see that this wasn't really about the water. "What's your name?" Dean asked, voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. The man blinked. "What?" "Your name. You paid good money to be here. I should know your name." "Eddie. Eddie Castellano." Dean nodded, looked at the woman next to Eddie, then back at Eddie. "Eddie, you're absolutely right." The room somehow got quieter. Eddie's mouth opened, closed, opened again. What?" "It's water," Dean said. "Apple juice, sometimes. Ginger ale, if they're out of apple juice. Been that way for about 8 years now." He turned, gestured at the puddle. "That right there? That's tap water from the Stardust kitchen. Probably lukewarm by now." Someone in the middle section laughed, a quick, nervous sound that died immediately. Dean could feel the weight of the room shifting, everyone trying to figure out if this was part of the show or if they were watching something break in real time. Eddie was still standing, but he'd stopped pointing. "So, you've been lying. To all of us." "Yeah," Dean said. He walked back to the microphone, picked it up. "I've been lying to you about how much I drink. You caught me, Eddie. Congratulations. Hold that moment in your mind, because this is where it gets interesting." Dean turned to the orchestra. "Manny, let's take 5. Get somebody to clean this up." Then to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause for a minute. Bar's still open. Feel free to grab a real drink while you're waiting. Unlike your host here." The lights came up halfway. People started moving, talking, a low buzz of confusion and excitement. Dean walked off stage, left without looking back. And in the wings, Pete Lawford was waiting with the stage manager and 2 writers. all of them looking like they'd just watched a car accident. "What the hell was that?" Pete said. Dean pulled a cigarette from his jacket pocket, lit it. "That was 8 years of careful planning going down the toilet because I got sloppy with a bottle." "You told them," one of the writers said. His name was Hal, young guy, early 30s, looked like he might throw up. "What was I supposed to do, Hal? Tell Eddie from Long Island that he can't trust his own eyes?" Pete grabbed Dean's shoulder. "Do you understand what you just did out there? The whole act is built on that image. The drunk routine, the jokes. People come to see Dean Martin, the lush, not Dean Martin, the guy who drinks apple juice." Dean took a long drag, exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "People come to see a show, Pete. I'm still giving them a show. Are you?" The stage manager, Artie, was a short man with thick glasses who'd been running the Stardust's main room for 12 years. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you just burned down the thing you've spent a decade building." Listen carefully to what happened next, because this is the part nobody talks about. Dean dropped the cigarette, ground it out with his shoe. "Get me a real bottle, J&B, unopened, and a fresh glass with ice." Hal's eyes went wide. "You're not serious. Get it." Artie hesitated, then nodded at one of the runners. The kid took off toward the bar. Dean turned back to Pete. "How much time before second set?" 22 minutes. "Good. That's enough time for everyone out there to have a couple drinks and start wondering if they imagined what they just saw." Pete shook his head. "Dean, if you go back out there with actual scotch, then I go back out there with actual scotch. What's the difference? The act is blown anyway, according to you." The runner came back with the bottle and glass. Dean took them, cracked the seal on the J&B, while they all watched, poured 3 fingers over ice, raised it to Pete. "To Eddie from Long Island," Dean said. "The only honest man in the room." He drank it. Real scotch, the taste cutting through the theater smoke and stage dust and nervous sweat. He hadn't had real scotch on stage in almost a decade. It burned exactly the way he remembered. Remember back to Eddie Castellano, standing in the front row with his wife pulling at his sleeve. Remember how his hands were shaking, because Eddie wasn't really mad about water in a whiskey bottle. Eddie was mad about something else entirely, and Dean had recognized it the second he'd looked into the man's eyes. Eddie had come to Vegas to feel like somebody, to sit in the front row at a Dean Martin show and tell the guys back at the plant about it, to feel cool by proximity. And then he'd seen the trick, the lie, and suddenly he wasn't cool. He was a mark, a sucker who'd bought into a con. And Dean Martin, who'd spent 20 years reading people from stages and nightclubs and TV sets, understood that better than anyone. The second set started at 11:15. Dean walked back out with the J&B bottle in one hand, the glass in the other. The lights came up, and he could see Eddie still sitting in the front row, his wife next to him, both of them looking tense. Dean set the bottle on the piano, held up the glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Before we start, I want to address the elephant in the room." He gestured at the spot where the puddle had been. Some stagehand had cleaned it up, but you could still see where the wood was darker. "About 45 minutes ago, a very observant gentleman named Eddie Castellano noticed that my whiskey was actually water, and he was 100% correct. I've been pulling that trick for years. Apple juice, water, ginger ale, whatever the bar had on hand that looked like scotch under the lights." The room was dead silent. You could hear the ventilation system, the clink of ice in someone's glass 3 tables back. Now, Eddie was upset about this, and I don't blame him. Nobody likes feeling tricked, so I want to make something very clear. Dean raised the glass higher. "This right here, this is real J&B scotch. 90 proof. I opened it backstage about 20 minutes ago. You can check the seal if you want." He took a drink. A real one, long enough that people could see his throat working. "Here's the thing, though." Dean set the glass down, picked up the microphone. "The drunk act, That was always an act. The jokes about drinking, the stumbling, the slurred words, all of it, carefully written, carefully rehearsed, carefully performed. And you know what? You all loved it, every single one of you, because it was fun, it was entertaining. It made you feel like you were watching something loose and dangerous and real. Stop for a second and picture the room from above, because what you're about to see only makes sense when you know who was sitting where. Eddie Castellano in the front row, arms crossed, trying to decide if he was still angry. His wife next to him, looking worried. 3 tables back, a couple from Cleveland who'd driven 16 hours to be here. Stage right, a group of businessmen from Chicago who'd been singing along to every song in the first set. Back near the bar, a woman in a red dress who'd been crying during Everybody Loves Somebody because it reminded her of her father. All of them waiting to see what Dean Martin would do next. So here's my question for you, Eddie. Dean pointed at him with the microphone. Did you enjoy the show before the bottle broke? Eddie shifted in his seat. Yeah, I did. Did you laugh at the jokes? Sure. Did you sing along? Some of them. Dean nodded. Then what difference does it make whether there was scotch in the glass or water? The show was the same either way. You had the same good time. The only thing that changed was what you thought you knew about me. Someone in the middle section started clapping, then someone else, then more. Not everyone. Dean could see some people still looking skeptical, still processing, but enough that it felt like the room was making a choice about what kind of night this was going to be. Dean held up a hand, quieting them. I'm not asking you to forget what you saw. I'm asking you to understand what you've been watching all along, a performance. And tonight, right now, with real scotch in my hand instead of apple juice, I'm going to give you the same performance I always do, because the drink isn't what makes it good. The drink was never what made it good. He turned to Manny. Let's do that some more. The orchestra started up, and Dean Martin sang the same way he'd sung 1,000 times before. A little loose, a little slurred, a little bit like a man who'd had too many and didn't care. The only difference was that now, instead of water in his glass, there was actual scotch, and he drank it, slow sips between verses, because Eddie from Long Island and 499 other people were watching. Before we go on, you need to understand one thing about Dean's rule for himself on stage. He'd quit drinking seriously back in 1957 after a doctor told him his liver was starting to show damage. Not quit completely. He'd have wine with dinner, a scotch after a long day, but the heavy drinking, the all-night Rat Pack binges, those were done. The drunk act had started as a way to keep the image alive without actually having to drink, a compromise between what the audience wanted and what his body could handle. And now here he was, 48 years old, on stage at the Stardust, drinking real scotch because a man in the front row had called his bluff. The show ran long. Dean did 4 encores, and by the time he sang the last note of Valère, it was close to 1 in the morning. The crowd gave him a standing ovation, Eddie Castellano and his wife among them. Dean bowed, waved, walked off stage with the bottle of J&B in his hand. It was 3/4 empty. Pete was waiting in the wings again, this time with Artie and Hal and 2 people Dean hadn't expected. Deanna, his daughter, who'd been watching from the back, and Jack Entratter, who owned the Sands and had been sitting in the manager's office listening to the whole thing on the house speakers. That, Jack said, was either the smartest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Dean set the bottle down on an equipment case. Which one do you think? I think you turned a disaster into something people are going to talk about for years. I also think you just made it a lot harder to do the act the old way. Deanna came over, hugged him. She smelled like her mother's perfume. Dad, are you okay? I'm fine, honey. You drank that whole bottle. Not the whole bottle. 3/4. That's not like you. Dean looked at her. This kid who'd grown up watching him pretend to be drunk on television and in nightclubs, who'd always known it was pretend because she'd seen him at home. Sober, present. Normal. No, he said. It's not. Notice what happened in the days after that night. Word spread fast in Vegas. The Stardust switchboard got so many calls asking about Dean's next show that they had to add extra operators. Variety ran a piece about it. Martin's water bottle breaks, and so does his act. Columnists wrote about whether Dean had planned it, whether Eddie Castellano was a plant, whether the whole thing was an elaborate meta-performance. Dean did 19 more shows at the Stardust over the next 2 weeks. Every single one sold out, and every single one he walked out with a fresh bottle of J&B, opened it in front of the crowd, and drank it while he sang. By the end of the run, his doctor called. Liver enzymes were up. Not dangerous yet, but heading that direction. Dean sat in his dressing room after the last show, looking at the medical report, and made a decision. He called Hal. I need you to write something new. Keep the drunk jokes, keep the stumbling, keep all of it. Hal was quiet for a moment. You think people will accept that? After what happened? They'll accept it because I'll tell them exactly what we're doing. First show back, I walk out. I show them the bottle. I tell them it's apple juice. No tricks, no lies. They know what they're getting. And if they don't like it, then we find out if the act works without the mystery. It did. The next run, at the Sands 3 months later, Dean opened with a bottle of apple juice and a joke. This is apple juice. I'm admitting it right now. If you came here hoping to watch me pickle my liver, you're going to be disappointed. The crowd laughed. They always laughed. But here's what almost nobody knew, what Dean never talked about in interviews or told anyone outside his immediate family. That night at the Stardust, when Eddie Castellano stood up and shouted about the water, Dean had recognized something in the man's face that went beyond anger or disappointment. He'd recognized shame. The shame of realizing you'd been fooled. The shame of feeling stupid in front of your wife and 499 strangers. And Dean Martin, who'd built a career on making people feel good, on making drunk look fun and life look easy, couldn't stomach the idea of leaving that man with that feeling. So he'd told the truth. Not because he wanted to, not because it was good for the act, but because Eddie Castellano deserved to hear it. The cost was real. Dean's relationship with Scotch got complicated after that. He'd proven he could still do it, could still drink real whiskey and perform at the same level, but he'd also proven he didn't need to. The mystique was gone. In its place was something more honest and, in its own way, more impressive, a performer who could make you believe he was drunk on apple juice. Frank Sinatra called him 2 weeks after the Stardust incident. I heard about your bottle problem. It wasn't a problem, Frank. It was a learning experience. You told them it was water. Apple juice, actually. But yeah, Frank laughed. That sharp bark that meant he was genuinely amused. You always were the honest one. Rest of us are all liars, and you're out here telling the truth to guys from Long Island. Guy had a point. Sure he did. Doesn't mean you had to agree with him. Dean watched the Vegas Strip from his hotel window. It was 4 in the afternoon, the sun making everything look washed out and tired. Frank, you ever get tired of the act? Which act? All of it. The whole thing. There was a long pause. Every day, Pally. Every day. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, and when Dean hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. Like he'd been holding his breath underwater and finally come up for air. Eddie Castellano sent a letter 3 weeks later. Care of the Stardust. Apologized for making a scene. Said he'd been having a bad day. His wife's mother was sick. Money was tight. He'd taken it out on Dean when he shouldn't have. Ended with, but thanks for being straight with me. That meant something. Dean kept the letter in his dressing room for the next 5 years. Every time he opened a bottle of apple juice before a show, he thought about Eddie, about honesty, about the difference between giving people what they want and giving them what they need. The drunk act continued. Dean Martin, the lovable lush, the king of cool with a glass in his hand and a cigarette dangling from his lips. But now there was a layer underneath it, visible if you looked close enough, an acknowledgement that yes, this is performance, yes, you're watching a show, and yes, that's exactly what makes it worth watching. In 1973, during the last season of The Dean Martin Show, he did a bit where he accidentally spilled his drink on camera. The liquid was clearly water, splashing across the studio floor, and Dean looked directly at the audience and said, "Don't worry, folks. It's just apple juice." The laugh was huge, bigger than it would have been if people still thought he was drinking real scotch, because they were all in on the joke now. They knew what they were watching, and they loved it anyway. That's the thing about secrets. Sometimes keeping them makes you mysterious, but sometimes telling them makes you real. And real, it turns out, plays just as well in Vegas as mystery ever did. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Dean Martin kept performing until 1988, and he never used real scotch on stage again after that run at the Stardust. Not because he couldn't handle it, though his doctor preferred he didn't, but because he didn't need to. The act worked on apple juice. It had always worked on apple juice. Eddie Castellano had proven that in reverse, the audience's enjoyment had nothing to do with what was in the glass. And somewhere in Long Island, for the rest of his life, Eddie Castellano told people about the night he caught Dean Martin drinking water on stage, about how Dean had admitted it in front of 500 people, about how the king of cool had looked him in the eye and told him the truth. It was Eddie's favorite story. He told it at parties, at work, to his kids, to anyone who would listen. And every time he told it, he ended the same way. And you know what? The second set was even better than the first.